Hi, this is Brian. Unfortunately, my recording of the session on Friday crashed, so I'm going to try and address one of the topics that we talked about Friday in this recording and share it with the class. So let me share my screen again and see how that works out this time. Okay, so what we were talking about in the context of digital currencies is how that fits in a historical context. And you may recall we talked once before about how a role of government at various points in the past and in various parts of the world has not been so much to issue a currency, but to sanction currency, or I should say sanction things, chunks of metal that have intrinsic value. So what we show here on the left, this is a, I believe, Chinese gold ingot that was sanctioned by a local official saying that this is an official amount, a trustworthy amount of gold. It's not just a yellow rock. And this continued for many, many, many centuries, and even into the late 19th and the early 20th century in some parts of the world, the role of government would have been to use the assaying equipment, like you see there on the right, and weigh pieces of silver or gold or other things and say, yay, verily, these are actually worth something. However, the other role has been for a government to have what I call intrinsic value currency, or intrinsic value, in this case, coins. Here we see a Persian, Japanese, American, and South African coin. This ranges from more than 1,000 years ago to a couple hundred years ago to 100 years ago to a couple years ago. But these coins all have a specified amount of silver or gold or some other precious metal in them. In fact, in the late 19th century and earliest 20th century, there were still laws levied by legislatures on central banks around the world to insist that there would be currency issued that had metal of a certain weight and purity. So for example, these United States of America silver dollars had a specific amount of silver in them. And when you had these coins, if all else failed, perhaps one of the governments might fall, but you'd still have your silver. That's a little different than what people call representative currency. In this case, this is a $1 bill. It's an obsolete design that would still be honored by the Central Bank of the United States. And if you look closely on this dollar bill, you'll notice that it says, this certifies there is on deposit in the Treasury $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand. And at various times in history, governments have replaced gold coins with pieces of paper that were representative in two ways of the gold or silver or other precious metals held by the central bank. The first way was to say, oh, here's a piece of paper and I have a certain amount of precious metal in my vault. This is the backing of the phrase, the gold standard. So there's gold that actually backs those notes. But in some cases, you could actually turn in that piece of paper if you wanted and be able to get that amount of gold. So even though the thing in your hand doesn't have intrinsic value the way a piece of gold would, there was some sort of promise that you could get that, or that that actually existed. In the modern era, though, what you have are what are called fiat currencies, or sometimes people like to say, because I told you so currencies. And what I mean by that is a modern $1 bill doesn't say that it's backed by a certain amount of gold because it's backed by a diversified portfolio of assets. And most governments around the world no longer issue notes that would allow the bearer to receive a certain amount of gold or silver or something like that. And this euro coin here isn't actually made of silver or gold. It's just some highly polished zinc and copper and things like that. So these are no longer of intrinsic value when you hold them in your hand. And you're no longer promised that there's a certain piece of gold or silver that you could have or behind your note. So the question then becomes is if we go along this continuum and we said a central bank were to have a digital currency and to issue a digital currency, how might that compare with these other choices? We've moved from things of intrinsic value to pieces of paper that are backed by things of intrinsic value, gold and silver and whatever, to pieces of paper and coins that are not themselves of intrinsic value, nor automatically backed directly by something like gold. And so how might people react to that? How might they feel or engage with a digital currency? And I think the discussion pointed out that, well, the reaction would be mixed. In some parts of the world, access to digital currencies would be fairly difficult. Persons wouldn't have the means, the technical means, they wouldn't have a cell phone or things like that to be able to get access to digital currencies the way they would you handing them a note or a coin or something like that. That said, in other parts of the world, the exact opposite experience is true, that the most humble of businesses or persons may not even accept physical currency anymore, but can take WeChat Pay or puts a QR code on their street card or something like that. And the other factor is preference. And preference varies widely based upon demographics, older versus younger, more affluent versus less affluent, people part of one societal or governmental structure and persons that are part of another. They may simply just prefer to use physical currencies or things backed by physical currencies. And some people may not care about that at all. Many of the students in the class had probably grown up much of their lives using digital currencies. And so the idea of using physical currency, or even the notion that physical currency backs a digital payment, might seem just kind of peculiar and quaint even. And then the last part is about trust. Some people over decades and lifetimes and generations very much trusted coins that had intrinsic value or pieces of paper that were backed by those precious metals of intrinsic value or pieces of paper and coins backed by governments they trust. Other people may look in the digital space and say, well, some of the people who are entering the digital space, I don't trust them. I don't want them to be able to track my movements, track my payments and things like that. I would rather use another payment mechanism. I'd rather have the anonymity of cash, as it were. So anyway, this is the topic that we talked about in class, which is sort of how digital payments fits in this continuum and how digital currencies have some pros and cons relative to a couple of different factors. And we'll talk more about that in a later class, but I hope this was a useful summary, and I hope you'll use the discussion board to share with your classmates certain ideas on this topic.